September 1st, 1943. The humid air over Rabaul shimmered like a mirage as Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai laughed, the laughter of a man who still believed the Empire of Japan ruled the skies. His one good eye scanned the American intelligence report, describing a new U.S. fighter named the Hellcat, a machine so heavy, so ugly, that it seemed impossible to fear. In that moment, every Japanese pilot in the tent shared the same certainty. America still did not understand how to build a true fighter. They were craftsmen of metal, not masters of spirit. The Zero was still the sky's god. What none of them knew was that this moment, this single careless laugh, marked the beginning of the end. Within 1 year, that same laughter would turn into silence over the Pacific, broken only by the roar of engines they could not outrun. The Hellcat was not just another enemy aircraft. It was a symbol of a civilization that had decided to win through reason, not romance. A machine that would strip away every illusion the Japanese pilots held about skill, honor, and destiny. To the men of the rising sun, war had always been personal, a contest of courage, a test of spirit. But this new American fighter refused to duel. It fought without emotion, without hesitation, without weakness. It climbed higher, struck harder, and survived what no human willpower could endure. The Hellcat was not faster in body, it was faster in evolution. Each battle was not a fight between equals, but between two worlds. One built on faith in the warrior, the other built on faith in the system. As the sun burned over the Pacific, Japanese aces who once believed themselves invincible began to understand a cruel truth. The war was no longer decided in the cockpit. It was decided in the factory, in the blueprint, in the mathematics of mass production. The Hellcat was not the enemy they had trained for. It was the future, and the future had already chosen its side. The pilots who laughed at it would soon write their final letters home, realizing too late that the machine they had mocked was not America's mistake. It was their own. September 1st, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. The sun was already brutal by mid-morning, baking the pierced steel planking beneath the rows of A6M Zero fighters. Pilots walked slowly toward their aircraft, the heat rippling in the distance, the metallic smell of fuel mixing with sea salt and sweat. Inside a dim operations tent, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai read the latest American intelligence report. His one good eye followed each line with calm amusement until suddenly he laughed. The laughter spread through the room like wildfire, bitter, confident, defiant. The Americans had built a new fighter, they said. It was heavy as a bomber, slow, clumsy. They called it the Hellcat. For Sakai and the others, it was proof that the enemy still didn't understand the essence of aerial combat. America could build as many planes as it wanted, but it could not manufacture spirit. The Japanese pilots were still the masters of the air. Their Zero fighters had ruled the Pacific for 2 years, from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, striking with surgical precision. Every Allied fighter that had faced them, the British Hurricane, the American P-40, even the Spitfire, had fallen before the Zero's grace and agility. The Zero was not just a weapon, it was an idea. It was the embodiment of the Japanese soul, stripped of waste, focused only on perfection. But beneath the laughter, behind the pride, there was something else, a fatigue too deep to name. Pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Aircraft maintenance was becoming harder. Gasoline was rationed. The empire was vast, but cracks had begun to show. Still they believed. Faith, not numbers, had carried them this far. The irony was cruel. While Japan believed it was winning through purity of design and courage, the United States had stopped believing in such things. The Americans had been humiliated once, but they had learned faster than anyone expected. Their engineers didn't try to copy the Zero. They studied it like an autopsy. They asked questions no samurai ever would. Why protect honor when you can protect the pilot? Why fight alone when you can fight as one machine? What happens when courage meets mathematics? The answer was being built in factories across America, 24 hours a day. The Hellcat was born from calculation, not philosophy. It was a contradiction made of steel, heavy, armored, and ugly, but terrifyingly efficient. Its very weight, the feature the Japanese mocked most, was its greatest weapon. But in September 1943, No one in Rabaul could imagine that this ungainly machine would soon become their executioner. Sakai folded the report and looked out toward the airfield where the morning flight prepared for patrol. His pilots were young, too young. Some had just enough flight time to take off and land. They had memorized the rituals of Bushido, the warrior code that glorified death over defeat, but they had never learned to fly against an enemy that fought like a machine. "If this Hellcat exists," one of them said, laughing nervously, "it will fall like the rest." Sakai smiled, but something in him hesitated. He had fought the Americans before. They were not the same enemy anymore. In those days, the Japanese Navy still believed in perfection over protection. Their planes had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and sometimes no radios. Weight was the enemy. Every gram saved meant more speed, more agility, more glory. But in combat, that philosophy meant one hit could turn a masterpiece into a coffin. And when the Hellcat appeared over the Pacific, its bullets didn't care about beauty. For the pilots of Japan, the sky had always been sacred ground. Flying was an art, not a science. Every maneuver carried meaning. Dogfighting was not about killing. It was about proving the purity of one's spirit. They had been taught that Americans fought clumsily, relying on machines instead of heart. But the new war, the War of 1943, no longer respected poetry. It respected production. Reports from distant islands began arriving quietly, almost unbelieved at first. Patrols that never returned. Entire squadrons erased from radarless skies. Survivors spoke of American planes that refused to die, that soaked up hits like beasts of iron. Some claimed the new Hellcat could climb straight up into the sun. Others whispered that the Americans could hear each other through the air, coordinating attacks in ways the Japanese couldn't imagine. The first reaction was disbelief, then anger, then silence. The truth was crueler than any rumor. The Hellcat was not meant to outfly the Zero. It was designed to outlive it. It could take damage, lose cylinders, leak oil, and still bring its pilot home. The Zero demanded perfection from its pilot. The Hellcat forgave imperfection, and in a long war, forgiveness is stronger than pride. In the officers' mess that night, talk of the Hellcat returned like an unwelcome ghost. Some dismissed it as propaganda. Others, the veterans who had seen too many friends vanish, said nothing. They stared into their rice bowls, listening to the wind against the tent, each wondering if the next patrol would be their last. None dared say it aloud, but the feeling spread. Maybe, just maybe, the Americans were no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting to win. It is difficult to describe what it means to realize that the enemy has outgrown you. The Japanese pilots were not fools. They felt the shift, even if they refused to name it. Each mission was now a gamble, each dogfight a memory waiting to be erased. They had been raised to believe that death in battle was beautiful. But beauty is not armor, and philosophy does not stop a bullet. By the end of September, the first official encounter between the Zero and the Hellcat would take place over Marcus Island. Only one Japanese pilot returned. His report was brief and confused. He described a plane that climbed faster than physics should allow, that dived with unnatural control, that turned war into calculation. His superiors dismissed it as exaggeration. They didn't understand that this was not an exaggeration. It was the future, and the future had teeth. The next weeks would prove it again and again. Dogfights turned into massacres. Pilots began avoiding direct combat, knowing that meeting a Hellcat in open sky meant almost certain death. The old tactics, tight turns, graceful rolls, surprise dives, no longer worked. The Hellcat refused to play the game. It fought without honor, without hesitation. To the Japanese it seemed soulless. But in truth it was the first aircraft to fight like the century itself. Mechanical, logical, inevitable. Still, the belief in the Zero persisted. It had to. For men who had lost everything else, faith in their aircraft was the last comfort. They painted the rising sun on its wings like a prayer. They repeated the old saying, "A Zero never dies in shame." But the shame was already there. It was written in the statistics, in the growing lists of names carved onto memorial tablets back home. Some pilots began keeping diaries, small fragments of thoughts before each mission. One wrote, "The new enemy does not fear death. He fears inefficiency." Another confessed, "We have become ghosts of a past age. We fight the future with our ancestors watching. Those words would never be read by their families. Their planes disappeared. Over the ocean, swallowed by the war they no longer understood. And so the laughter that had begun on that hot morning in Rabaul began to fade. The pilots still smiled, still saluted, still spoke of honor. But inside, they knew. Something was coming. Something too large, too mechanical, too relentless to resist. The sound of it would soon fill the Pacific, a storm of propellers and machine guns, the voice of a civilization that had replaced courage with calculation. The Zero had ruled the skies by grace. The Hellcat would rule them by gravity. And as the first shadows of that truth passed over the islands of the Empire, the question hung heavy in every pilot's mind. How do you fight an enemy who no longer believes in fear? They didn't know it yet, but their reign of supremacy had already ended the moment they laughed. The sky that once belonged to them was already lost. They just hadn't fallen from it yet. October 1943. Over the Pacific, the sky had begun to change color. The deep blue that once belonged to Japan was turning gray. Somewhere above the clouds, something new was flying. A sound, a shadow, a force. The pilots who had mocked the Hellcat now looked for it in every glint of sunlight, every echo of an engine. It was no longer a rumor. It was a threat with wings. Petty Officer Yoshio Fukui was among the first to meet it. He took off from Marcus Island in his Zero, escorting a reconnaissance plane, confident as always. The sun was behind him, the sea calm below. Then, out of the horizon, came 6 dark shapes. He thought they were bombers at first, large, thick-bodied, flying too high and too fast. But as they turned, he saw the truth. Fighters, bigger than any he had ever seen. He dove to attack. It was what he had always done, but the enemy did not follow the script. Instead of turning to face him, the Hellcat went vertical, climbing straight up, impossible against gravity. Within seconds, it was above him, turning over like a hammer and falling onto his tail. The sky that had always obeyed him suddenly betrayed him. He felt the bullets before he heard them. 17 holes ripped through his Zero in 3 seconds. He escaped only by throwing his plane into a spin, praying to a sky that no longer listened. His wingman never returned. The report he filed that day was short and confused. Enemy fighter F6F type, climbs like no other, fires 6 guns, cannot be followed. No one believed him. The next week, more pilots died. The Japanese command tried to make sense of it. How could something so heavy move so fast? How could an enemy so clumsy win against masters of agility? The answer was invisible. Power. The Hellcat's massive Pratt & Whitney engine produced 2,000 horsepower, 700 more than the Zero. It did not dance through the air, it conquered it. It ignored elegance, it replaced grace with physics. But the real terror wasn't just speed or armor, it was psychology. The Hellcat changed the meaning of fear. Before, a Japanese pilot feared failure, dishonor, death. Now he feared something worse, irrelevance. The old art of air combat, the duel between warriors, was ending. The Hellcat fought like a system, not a man. It was part of a larger machine that extended from the deck of an aircraft carrier to the factories of Long Island. Each plane was a cog in an empire of steel, logic, and electricity. The Japanese pilots could not understand it because they had never seen war as industrial before. They saw the battle as an extension of self, skill, instinct, spirit. But the Americans had stopped seeing it that way. They didn't need heroes anymore. They built tools that made heroes unnecessary. The first time a squadron of Zeros met an entire formation of Hellcats, they expected another familiar dance of spirals and turns. Instead, the Americans came in formation, precise and silent, like an assembly line in the sky. When the Zeros dived, the Hellcats didn't scatter. They absorbed the attack. Their armor took the hits. Their radios kept them together. Then they climbed, always up, into the sun, into advantage. The Zeros followed and stalled. The Japanese fighters fell like leaves. The Hellcats returned like hawks. Imagine being inside one of those cockpits, your plane shaking from bullet impacts, your instruments useless, your body soaked in sweat and fear. You look out your canopy and see not a single enemy face, only blue shapes, moving in patterns too precise to be human. It feels less like fighting men and more like being hunted by the future itself. For the Japanese pilots, Every mission became a test of sanity. Each takeoff carried the same silent thought: will I still exist when I land? They began sleeping less, speaking less. Letters home became shorter. They stopped describing victories and started describing weather. The laughter that once filled the airfields turned to whispers. And yet, they kept flying, because that was what they had been born to do. The Bushido Code did not allow surrender, only endurance. By late October, even the veterans could sense that something deeper was happening. The Hellcat was not just winning battles, it was rewriting the rules of war. Every encounter felt different, organized, inevitable. The Americans seemed to know where the Japanese were before they appeared. Pilots began to suspect the impossible. The enemy could see through clouds, through darkness. And they were right. American radar was now guiding fighters to exact positions, turning each engagement into a planned execution. Lieutenant Tanemizu, a survivor of several encounters, later said, "We fought the air, they fought the map." He tried to warn his commanders, but the Empire's faith in tradition was stronger than any evidence. The Japanese Navy still believed that spirit could defeat science, that courage could rewrite equations, but courage does not bend metal or multiply engines. The irony was painful. The same faith that had built the Zero now blinded them. In the pursuit of perfection, they had created fragility. Every pilot they lost was irreplaceable, a master of art destroyed by the machinery of progress. The Americans, on the other hand, trained thousands, built replacements faster than Japan could bury its dead. The sky itself seemed to favor the practical over the poetic. Somewhere between belief and despair, a quiet transformation began inside the hearts of those pilots. They no longer flew to win. They flew because the alternative was unthinkable. To stop flying was to admit that the Empire's dream had ended. To live was to live in shame. And yet, more and more, they found themselves surviving, not by choice, but by luck, escaping the Hellcat's claws by clouds or storms, not by skill. At night, some pilots wrote confessions in their diaries. "We thought the Americans had no soul, but it is we who are empty now." Another wrote, "Their machines are not beautiful, but they do not die." The truth was unbearable. The Japanese were not just losing a war, they were watching their entire philosophy collapse. If you think about it, their story is not so different from ours. We all believe in something, an idea, a way of life, a sense of pride in how we do things, and when the world changes faster than we can adapt, we feel what they felt. That strange, sinking realization that skill and passion are no longer enough, that the rules have changed without warning. The Hellcat was their automation, their technology shift, their silent revolution. It was the moment when faith in the old ways met the cold hand of progress and lost. There is a lesson hidden in that tragedy. The men who flew those Zeros were not fools. They were brilliant, dedicated, and brave beyond measure. But they were trapped in a story that no longer matched reality. The Hellcat did not just destroy planes, it destroyed illusions. It forced the world to admit that wars, like civilizations, are won by those who evolve faster. And that is why this story matters today. Because every generation faces its own Hellcat, something new, unstoppable, and misunderstood. The question is not whether it will come. The question is whether we will learn from those who refuse to see it coming. In the Pacific, by the end of 1943, the laughter that once greeted the Hellcat had vanished completely. The Zero still flew, but now it was hunted. Each new engagement took more lives. Each battle brought fewer survivors. The pride that had lifted Japan into the clouds was now the same pride that would drag it down. But this is not just history, it is a mirror. When we look at those young pilots staring into the sun, we see ourselves, our confidence, our denial, our fragile belief that the future can be delayed by courage alone. It never can. So before we continue deeper into this story, before we reach the moment when the war in the skies becomes something darker than anyone could imagine, pause for a second. Think about the courage it takes to face change and the cost of refusing it. If you want to keep exploring these untold stories of the ones who lost, if you want to understand how their fall shaped the world we live in today, then look for the red button somewhere in the corner of your screen. Click it now. Join us. Because what comes next will change the way you see World War II, and maybe the way you see the world itself. December 1943. Over the Truk Lagoon, The sky was no longer a place of duels. It had become a battlefield of systems. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the same man who once led the attack on Pearl Harbor, now watched returning aircraft limp onto the runway, leaking fuel and smoke. The mechanics counted holes in their wings, like doctors measuring wounds. Each one told the same story. They had met Hellcats. None could explain how the enemy found them so easily, or why every engagement felt like walking into a trap. But Fuchida suspected the truth. The Americans were no longer flying blind. What Japan called intuition, the Americans called information. Hidden aboard their carriers were radar operators who could see through storms, who could follow Japanese aircraft long before they were visible. The Hellcat pilots flew guided by unseen eyes, their paths calculated by invisible hands. It was as if the Americans had extended their senses into the sky itself. For the first time in history, the air war had become mathematical, to Japanese pilots trained in instinct and discipline. This was terrifying. A warrior could master combat, but how could he fight against something that could see him through the clouds? One surviving pilot wrote in his journal, "We were no longer fighting men. We were fighting a mind that existed beyond the horizon." And that was exactly what the Hellcat represented, a mind made of wires, radios, and logic. The Americans had found a way to merge human courage with mechanical control. But what happens when courage meets control, when spirit faces precision? Lieutenant Commander Tanemizu tried to explain it to his men. Forget everything you know about combat. The Americans do not fight as individuals anymore. They fight like a machine. One covers the other, one climbs while another dives. When you chase one, the other is already behind you. His words sounded like blasphemy to men raised to believe that skill was sacred. Yet within weeks, his warning would prove true. Entire formations vanished into the Pacific, not because of cowardice or weakness, but because the rules of war had changed, and they hadn't. By now, Japanese intelligence had collected fragments of evidence, intercepted radio chatter, recovered wreckage, even shell casings that revealed impossible firing patterns. The Hellcat's 6 Browning machine guns unleashed over 4,000 rounds per minute, more than double what the Zero could return. Each bullet carried nearly 5 times the impact energy. In a single 3-second burst, a Hellcat could deliver the same destructive force as an entire Zero squadron. This wasn't just a difference in design, it was a difference in philosophy. The Japanese believed in precision. The Americans believed in volume, one aimed for perfection, the other aimed for certainty. Yet the greatest shock wasn't technological, it was cultural. The Hellcat was built around one revolutionary idea. The pilot's life mattered. Every inch of the aircraft was designed to protect him. Armor plates around the cockpit, bulletproof glass, self-sealing fuel tanks. These details seemed meaningless to Japanese engineers at first. To them, protection meant weakness. The warrior was supposed to risk everything. But in America, survival was strength. Every pilot who lived to fight again was a multiplying force. Japan was spending lives. America was investing them. Imagine the realization when that truth began to spread. Pilots who once believed death was the ultimate honor now saw their enemies treated as something worth saving. The difference was moral, not mechanical. The Hellcat was a declaration that a human being was not a tool of war. He was its purpose, and that belief, more than its guns or engines, would reshape the air war forever. But how do you admit your entire way of thinking has become obsolete? By early 1944, Japanese training bases were desperate. Fuel shortages forced instructors to use gliders instead of fighters. Cadets practiced attacks with wooden rifles. Many were sent to the front without ever firing a real bullet. The skies that had once been filled with experts were now populated by the unprepared. Meanwhile, American pilots arrived with hundreds of flight hours and perfect communication. Their tactics were not improvised. They were rehearsed like choreography. They fought not for glory, but for completion of the mission. The difference was visible even in their silence. Hellcat pilots did not boast or taunt over the radio. They spoke in calm, coordinated tones, guided by code and clarity. Japanese pilots, once proud of their freedom, now found their individuality turning into isolation. Their radios were often removed to save weight, a detail. That now felt like a sentence. They flew alone even when surrounded by comrades. At first, the Japanese commanders tried to deny the scale of their losses. Reports were softened. Numbers were buried. The Empire could not admit weakness, but silence could not hide the smoke. Rabaul, Truk and the Marianas became graveyards of aircraft. Every week, fewer planes returned, and those who did return carried stories that made even the bravest hesitate. One pilot described being attacked from above by an enemy he had never seen. The Hellcat struck from the sun, perfectly timed, perfectly placed. They always know, he said. They always arrive where we are weakest. Another reported that even in cloud cover, the Hellcats seemed to find them with unnatural accuracy. What no one could explain then was that the Americans had radar-guided fighter direction, a network of communication linking ship and sky, turning every dogfight into a coordinated hunt. And yet, there was something deeper happening beneath the statistics. The Japanese pilots began to lose not only their lives, but their belief in control. The air, once a place of freedom, became a trap. The men who had once flown as gods now flew as prey. The anxiety followed them everywhere. Some began to hesitate during takeoff. Others overcompensated, diving into hopeless attacks just to feel alive again. The loss of mastery over the sky was not just tactical. It was spiritual. Have you ever felt it? That moment when something you thought you understood suddenly stops working, when everything you've mastered turns into a mystery. That was the feeling in every cockpit now. The Zero had been their identity. The Hellcat had become their mirror, showing them everything they refused to see. As 1944 began, even the senior officers could feel it. The war they had planned was gone. The pilots they sent out each morning were ghosts already. One wrote in his notebook, "We are fighting time itself." He wasn't wrong. The industrial age had reached the sky, and Japan's faith in purity could not keep up with America's faith in progress. In mess halls across the Pacific, silence replaced laughter. Radios played songs about victory while men prepared for missions they knew were lost. Commanders still spoke of honor, but the word had lost its power. It was a mask for despair. Behind that mask, they knew that the balance had tipped, and that no amount of courage could reverse it. And still, they flew, because sometimes belief is stronger than truth, and the pilots of Japan believed, even as their world fell apart beneath them. They believed that if they flew high enough, fast enough, bravely enough, they could still touch the sky that once belonged to them. But faith cannot stop gravity, and the higher they flew, the harder the fall that waited. June 1944. The Pacific was no longer a battlefield of equals. It was a stage for annihilation. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot began under a sky so clear that no one could pretend not to see what was coming. The Japanese launched 450 aircraft, their last attempt to stop the advancing American fleet. Among them were veterans of Pearl Harbor and young recruits barely able to read their instruments. They took off from carriers that would never see home again. The orders were simple: destroy the enemy or die trying. American radar detected them more than 150 miles away. Before the Japanese could even see the ocean below, Hellcats were climbing to intercept. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell and his air group rose like an iron storm, calm and coordinated. They did not fight for honor. They fought for completion, efficiency, survival. When the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared, the Hellcats fell upon them with mathematical precision. In just 12 minutes, 42 Japanese planes vanished. Not one Hellcat was lost. To the Japanese pilots, the experience was beyond comprehension. They had faced defeat before, but never this kind of invisibility, this mechanical certainty. The sky itself seemed alive, hostile, aware of their presence. They could not hide. Every maneuver, every climb, every dive was anticipated. It felt as if the enemy had already seen the future and written it down. By the end of the battle, more than 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. American losses were fewer than 30. The pilots who survived returned to their carriers in silence, many refusing to meet each other's eyes. Some wrote in their diaries that night, "We are no longer fighting men, we are fighting destiny." They began calling the Hellcat by a new name, the Executioner. The war that followed was not war as they had known it. It was extermination in motion. In every engagement, the Hellcat appeared out of nowhere, guided by radar and coordination that no Japanese commander could comprehend. The Americans had turned the art of war into an equation. Every battle was solved before it began. The scale of destruction became unbearable. By the end of 1944, Japan had lost nearly 90% of its experienced naval aviators. Out of the 3,000 pilots who had fought at the start of the Pacific War, fewer than 400 remained alive. The rest were gone, burned, drowned, or vanished in the ocean without a trace. Each new pilot trained had less experience, less fuel, less time. Some entered battle with fewer than 100 flight hours. Against the Hellcat, it was suicide disguised as duty, and yet Japan continued to fight. Because to stop was to accept the unthinkable, that the empire of the rising sun built on divine destiny could be defeated by a machine. The cultural wound ran deeper than any loss. To die in battle was glorious. To be defeated by technology was shameful beyond words. At Formosa, that shame became reality. In October 1944, the Japanese threw everything they had at the American carrier groups approaching the Philippines. 700 planes rose to meet the enemy. Only half returned. For 3 days, the sky burned. American gunners filled it with tracers, and Hellcats swept through formations with mechanical calm. The Japanese claimed to have sunk 20 carriers. The truth, they had destroyed none. Their real losses, 330 aircraft and most of their remaining veterans. The survivors brought back stories that sounded impossible. Hellcats appearing from clouds as if guided by invisible eyes. Perfectly timed attacks that struck from above, below and behind at once. The Americans, they said, fought as if they could read our thoughts. What they could not see was the radar network guiding every move, the shipboard controllers directing fighters like pieces on a chessboard. The Japanese were fighting not pilots, but a system, a mind that never slept, never tired, never hesitated. In the aftermath of Formosa came the great Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. 9 Japanese carriers, 450. Aircraft, 15 American carriers, nearly 1,000 planes, half of them Hellcats. It was a test of everything the Japanese still believed in: courage, surprise, and sacrifice. But courage cannot penetrate armor, and sacrifice cannot outrun bullets. On the morning of October 24, 1944, Commander McCampbell and his wingman Roy Rushing intercepted 60 Japanese aircraft. In 90 minutes, they destroyed 15. McCampbell shot down 9 by himself, the most in a single mission in naval history. His plane returned untouched. For Japan, it was the breaking point. The skies were no longer contested. They belonged entirely to the Hellcat. That night, Japanese officers met in silence. They had no pilots left, no carriers worth repairing, no hope of victory. But the Empire demanded action, and so, out of despair, a new word entered their vocabulary: kamikaze. The first official kamikaze mission launched the next morning. Lieutenant Yukio Seki led 5 planes toward the American fleet. He was 23 years old, newly married. His plane carried a 250-kilogram bomb. He struck the escort carrier USS St. Lo, sinking it instantly and killing 143 sailors. The Japanese High Command celebrated it as rebirth, proof that spirit could still triumph over steel. But it was not triumph. It was confession. In the following months, 1,900 kamikaze sorties were launched. Nearly all were destroyed before reaching their targets. The Hellcats tore through them mercilessly, shooting down hundreds of suicide planes before they could dive. For every 1 kamikaze that hit, 9 were killed in vain. Yet the attacks continued, because Japan had no other weapon left but death. At Okinawa in 1945, this tragedy reached its peak. The island became a graveyard for aircraft and men alike. The Hellcat flew 38,000 combat missions in the campaign, claiming 2,351 aerial victories while losing only 249 planes. Each Hellcat division covered the fleet like a moving wall. They called one tactic the mowing machine. 4 planes flying in a horizontal line, sweeping through enemy formations like blades. It was industrialized warfare in the purest form, and the Japanese had no answer. For the pilots who faced them, the war no longer made sense. They were not fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting inevitability. Every takeoff felt like a funeral. Every mission felt like a confession of guilt. One pilot wrote in his diary, "Our deaths no longer matter. Even the gods have left the sky." By the summer of 1945, the Pacific Air War was over in all but name. The once mighty Imperial Navy Air Service was gone. Out of 18,000 trained pilots who had begun the war, fewer than 100 combat veterans remained alive. The rest were names on fading paper. Meanwhile, the United States had built more than 12,000 Hellcats in just 2 years, one every 60 minutes from a single factory. The contrast was unbearable. Japan produced only 5,000 fighters of all types in 1944. The war had become a contest of production, not passion. America had transformed its economy into a weapon. Japan had transformed its warriors into martyrs. And yet, the most tragic part was not the defeat itself. It was what the pilots realized too late. The Hellcat was never just a fighter plane. It was a message. Every bulletproof plate, every radio transmission, every radar ping spoke the same truth. The future belonged not to heroes, but to systems. The Hellcat was what happened when a nation decided that its soldiers were worth protecting. For Japan, that idea was unthinkable. They believed honor came from sacrifice. The Americans believed victory came from preservation. Between those two beliefs lay the entire difference between collapse and survival. When the war ended, Japan had lost 2.3 million soldiers and nearly 400,000 civilians. The United States had lost fewer than 420,000 in total across all fronts. Numbers that tell more than strategy, they tell philosophy. After the surrender, American Hellcats were the first Allied planes to land on Japanese soil. Their engines shut down over the same airfields where once the Zero had reigned. Japanese engineers studied them in silence, tracing the lines of their armor, the complexity of their engines, the weight they had mocked for years. They found perfection not in grace, but in balance. They found strength not in purity, but in compromise. And they finally understood. One of them, Professor Jiro Horikoshi, the designer of the Zero, said quietly after the war, "We designed a weapon for men who believed in death. They designed one for men who believed in life." That was the final revelation, the true defeat. The Zero had been an instrument of courage. The Hellcat had been an instrument of civilization. One fought for glory, the other for continuity. And in the end, continuity always wins. In every war, there comes a moment when belief meets reality. For Japan, that moment came in the roar of the Hellcat's engine, in the radar hum of an unseen enemy, in the silence of an airfield littered with empty cockpits. Their greatest sin was not arrogance, it was devotion. Devotion to a world that no longer existed. As the American occupation began, surviving pilots walked among the wreckage of their Zeros, touching the bullet holes like scars. Some refused to speak. Others whispered to the ghosts of their comrades. They understood now that the war had not only destroyed their nation, it had destroyed their idea of what it meant to fight. And in that realization, there was no anger left. Only clarity. The Hellcat had not just won a war, it had ended an era, the age of the warrior who believed that sacrifice alone could change the world. In the years that followed, many of those same men became builders, teachers, and fathers. They carried the memory of their defeat not as shame but as understanding. They had seen the future in the shape of a machine, and they knew that the next wars would not be fought by heroes, but by systems that remembered their mistakes. When the final Hellcat was retired from service, it was displayed in museums across the world. Visitors saw it as a symbol of victory, but to those who had once faced it, it was something else entirely, a monument to transition, a reminder that progress is merciless, and that every empire, no matter how proud, eventually becomes the past. August 15th, 1945. The war was over, but Japan did not yet understand what that meant. The Emperor's voice came through the radio for the first time in history. His tone was calm, distant, almost ghostly. "We have decided to endure the unendurable," he said. Across the country, people knelt in silence. Some wept. Others stared at the ground, unable to process the sound of surrender. For the men who had fought in the sky, the pilots who once ruled the Pacific, this was not the end of a war. It was the end of meaning itself. At Atsugi Airfield, where the Zero had once taken off in glory, the remaining aircraft stood like bones. The paint had peeled. The fuel tanks were empty. The few surviving pilots stood beside them, unsure what to do with their hands, their eyes, their lives. Among them was Captain Minoru Genda, the man who had helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. He listened to the Emperor's voice, his face expressionless. Around him stood boys barely 18 years old, trained too late to fight. They had never fired their guns. Their war had ended before it began. When the American Hellcats landed later that month, there was no resistance. Japanese mechanics and pilots gathered to watch as the blue planes touched down on their own soil. The roar of the engines seemed to carry not triumph, but inevitability. For the first time, they saw their enemy up close. The Hellcat was larger than they had imagined, solid and scarred, a machine that looked as if it had been built to last forever. One American pilot climbed down, smiled awkwardly, and waved. The gesture was simple, human, disarming. For a moment, the distance between victor and defeated disappeared. It was just men, tired of killing. Engineer Jiro Horikoshi, the creator of the Zero, walked around a captured Hellcat days later. He ran his hand over its armor, its thick glass, its rivets. Everything about it violated what he had believed. It was heavy, inelegant, and yet perfectly balanced. "We designed an aircraft for artists," he whispered, "and they designed one for survivors." That single sentence explained everything Japan had lost. The truth that emerged after the war was more devastating than any bomb. Japan had been defeated long before Hiroshima, long before Nagasaki. It had been defeated by an idea. While the empire worshipped sacrifice, America had learned to worship efficiency. While Japan sent its best pilots to die, America trained thousands more to live. The Hellcat was not just a weapon, it was a philosophy. It said that the value of life was greater than the value of victory, that survival itself was strength. For the pilots who returned home, the silence was unbearable. Many never spoke again about what they had seen. Others wrote memoirs that read like prayers, trying to find meaning in what had happened. Saburo Sakai, the ace who had once laughed at the Hellcat, lived long enough to see Japan become a peaceful nation. In his final interview before his death in 2000, he said, "The Hellcat taught us something we refused to learn. It taught us that courage without wisdom is suicide." His words carried the weight of generations. The young men who once believed in divine destiny became the last witnesses of a world that no longer existed. They saw the birth of a new age, an age where machines spoke for nations, where calculations replaced honor, where survival became victory. For Japan, it was not humiliation but transformation. The defeat forced them to rebuild, not as warriors, but as creators. If you walk through the museums of Tokyo today, you can still find fragments of that era. Pieces of Zero fuselages, worn photographs, flight helmets stained with sweat. Near them, you might also find a Hellcat, preserved in pristine condition, its dark blue paint still shining after 80 years. Schoolchildren stand before it, reading plaques that describe horsepower, engine type, and production numbers. But those statistics do not tell the real story. The real story is written in silence, the silence of the pilots who once believed they could outrun the future. Every empire imagines itself eternal. Every generation believes its way of thinking will last forever. But history is cruel and honest. It reminds us that greatness fades when it refuses to evolve. The men of Japan learned that lesson with their lives. They were not villains. They were dreamers trapped in a system that demanded their deaths. They believed they were fighting for honor, and perhaps they were. But honor without adaptation becomes tragedy. What makes this story powerful is not the victory of one nation over another, but the moment of awakening that followed. The realization that progress does not belong to those who are strongest, but to those who can learn. That courage means nothing without compassion. And that true greatness lies not in dying for your country, but in building a world where no one has to. Today, the descendants of those same pilots live in peace. Their country, rebuilt from ashes, became one of the most innovative and peaceful nations on Earth. They learned what their leaders never could. That strength without humanity is hollow. The Hellcat's roar may have faded from the skies, but its echo remains, a reminder that the machines we build reflect the values we choose. As the sun sets over the Pacific, it shines on the graves of those who flew for both sides. In death there are no enemies, only lessons. And so as you reach this point of the story, ask yourself, what would you have believed if you were one of them? Would you have laughed at the weight of the Hellcat, too sure of your own mastery? Would you have fought until the end, knowing it was hopeless? Or would you have found the courage to change before it was too late? These questions are not about the past. They are about us. Because every generation faces its own Hellcat. Technology, change, progress, they come whether we are ready or not. The only choice we have is whether to adapt or to fall. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about war, pride, or humanity, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, click the red button in the corner, and help us keep these stories alive. Like the video, share it, and leave your thoughts or questions in the comments, even anonymously if you wish. Your voice matters, because remembering the past is not about guilt or glory. It is about ensuring that what happened once will never happen again.